In introduction, Troy Donahue was an actor that broke out onto the Hollywood scene in the late 1950s and proved a reliable presence on the screen for several years. Sadly, substance abuse issues plagued the actor throughout the majority of his life, and this would cause his career to fall apart later on. Nowadays, the late Troy Donahue is rarely revered, if he's even talked about at all. Some have even suggested that the actor was always outshone on the screen by his leading ladies, which included longtime friend Connie Stevens. She visited Troy just before his passing in September of 2001. Join Factsverse as we explore how Troy Donahue says he was loaded all the time before his demise. Troy Donahue was no Rock Hudson. Early life and name change. Troy Donahue was born on January 27, 1936 in New York City. At birth, he was not Troy Donahue but Merle Johnson Jr., named after his father, Merle Johnson Sr. His father held a top-level executive position at General Motors, reflecting a family life that offered some measure of financial comfort. Meanwhile, his mother pursued a career as a stage actress, thus exposing young Merle to the world of performance long before he ever dreamed of stepping onto the Hollywood stage himself. This early proximity to show business didn't immediately stoke an interest in acting, though. Troy's adolescence took him in different directions. He attended a military academy and had various educational experiences that did not initially include the aspiration to stand in front of a camera. The choice to rechristen Merle Johnson Jr. as Troy Donahue came courtesy of Henry Wilson, a Hollywood press agent known for inventing iconic names for his stable of hopeful stars. Wilson was the same man who conjured up the names Tab Hunter and Rock Hudson, monikers so seamless that many fans took for granted that these handsome men were actually named Tab and Rock from birth. Henry Wilson had an eye for how all American names could shape a public persona: short, punchy, masculine, perfect for a marquee. In Troy's case, the name managed to exude both a breezy youthfulness and a certain old-world heroism. It was a brand tailored to catch the attention of female fans and convey that this was a leading man in the making. Yet Troy Donahue's transformation from Merle Johnson Jr. was about more than a marketing gimmick. In the old studio system, a name was the first hook, the immediate invitation to audiences. The era of Clark Gable, Marilyn Monroe, and Rock Hudson was still in full swing, and each name told a story in itself. So, Troy Donahue was meant to suggest an up-and-coming matinee idol, a golden boy poised to inherit the star power mantle of the big studios. While it would indeed garner attention, his bright blonde hair and chiseled features doing much of the heavy lifting, this rebranded identity also set a standard the real Merle Johnson Jr. would struggle to live up to. Even with the name change and the familial ties to performance through his mother, Troy's path to acting was not immediate. He spent his younger years relatively apolitical about the world of Hollywood. His father's success in business meant the family could afford a comfortable lifestyle, and it did not appear that Troy would need to scramble for a career as a performer. Yet behind the scenes, the seeds of potential were being planted. Living in proximity to New York's robust theater scene, visiting his mother during stage rehearsals, and seeing firsthand how performances were crafted, all of these experiences were quietly shaping him. However, as he grew older, certain misfortunes, including the loss of his father, would eventually set him on a course that deviated from what was once expected. Being in a household where both business and performance were present gave Troy something of a dichotomous foundation. He understood the stability and structure of a corporate world through his father, while also glimpsing the creative and, at times, volatile life of an artist through his mother. So by the time a Hollywood press agent offered him a new name, he might have recognized it as an almost symbolic realignment with his mother's theatrical side. Whether Troy consciously felt this connection or not, he was no longer simply Merle Johnson Jr., the son of a General Motors executive. He was instead stepping into a spotlight designed to highlight his potential as a star. College years and move to Hollywood. Although his mother was a stage actress, Troy's initial ambivalence toward show business persisted through high school. He found himself heading off to a military academy, partly due to discipline and possibly at his father's urging, given the older man's corporate background. Attending a military academy was no casual affair. It imposed strict schedules, discipline, and a focus on leadership and duty. It was a world away from the glamour of theatrical life. However, these formative experiences, especially after his father's death, would shape Troy's resilience in ways he didn't anticipate. When it came time for college, Troy enrolled at Columbia University, a prestigious institution located in his own birth city of New York. There, he pursued studies in journalism, a field markedly different from acting. It's telling that Troy initially envisioned a future writing or reporting on stories rather than performing in them. Journalism offered a blend of intellectual rigor and curiosity about the human condition. If anything, it suggested a more stable route than the gamble of heading to Hollywood. Yet fate, as it often does in such stories, had other plans. While at Columbia, Troy began participating in theatrical productions, discovering that he enjoyed the immediacy and emotional charge of acting. The stage allowed him an expressive outlet he hadn't experienced in his journalism studies. He found camaraderie in the theatrical community at the university, fellow students, professors, and mentors who encouraged him. Before long, what had started as a mere extracurricular activity became a true passion. The applause, the sense of stepping into someone else's shoes, the rapport he built with other performers in the audience, all of this illuminated a path that diverged sharply from the one he'd originally planned. Before he could graduate, Troy made a bold decision to chase his dream. He dropped out of Columbia, packed his bags, and set his sights on Hollywood. Perhaps he'd grown tired of the constraints that the East Coast academic world placed on him, or maybe he was simply emboldened by the possibility of stardom. Whatever his precise motivation, Troy was now in motion. This moment underlines a type of rebellious courage and a willingness to gamble on a future that was anything but assured. Hollywood in the mid to late 1950s still possessed the vestiges of the studio system. Major studios such as MGM, Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, Paramount, and Universal had large rosters of contract players. For an aspiring actor, success was about being in the right place at the right time and forging the right connections. Many discovered, however, that Hollywood was also filled with eager hopefuls pouring into the city, all vying for the same few roles. Some young men and women languished in obscurity, while others caught a stroke of luck, an audition invitation here, a chance meeting there, and soared quickly to minor fame. Troy's subsequent dealings with Universal Pictures, signing a contract, adopting an entirely new identity, and making his film debut in 1957's Man Afraid, illustrate a process that countless actors had undergone before him. The difference is that for many, these debut films quickly faded, overshadowed by bigger roles. Troy faced that same risk. Man Afraid didn't instantly catapult him to the A-list, but it gained him enough credibility to land a more lucrative contract at Warner Brothers. The essential step had been taken. Troy Donahue was in the system. Whether he would remain there, let alone thrive, depended on timing, the public's tastes, and his own personal resolve. In retelling these events later in his career, Troy sometimes reflected on the near mythical nature of his discovery story. Not many actors got that big break within months of arriving in Hollywood, let alone by bumping into a high-level industry figure at a beach. It contributed to his lore, the idea that he was destined, or at least well-suited, for Hollywood's bright lights. But destiny is a tricky thing. While it might have aligned with Troy's initial burst of success, it certainly didn't shield him from the darker days ahead. Discovery and rise to fame. As the legend goes, Troy Donahue was discovered by William Asher while eating a cheeseburger at the beach, and that offhand moment changed the trajectory of his life. William Asher, who would go on to direct iconic television series like Bewitched, was already an influential figure. By encouraging Troy to sign with Universal Pictures, Asher effectively launched the young actor's career. In 1957, Troy made his screen debut in Man Afraid. Though the film itself is not widely celebrated today, it marked the official starting line of a film career that would soon see Troy's face plastered on magazines nationwide. Yet Troy's tenure with Universal would be short-lived, as Warner Brothers offered him an even better contract. This shift was significant because Warner Brothers had the power, the budget, and the marketing machinery to mold Troy into a full-fledged star. Their confidence in him crystallized when he starred in the 1959 film A Summer Place. Cast as a romantic lead opposite Sandra Dee, Troy suddenly found himself in a major production backed by a comprehensive publicity campaign. A Summer Place became a substantial hit, buoyed by the palpable chemistry between its two young leads and by the broader cultural climate that was embracing stories of teenage love and familial tension. Sandra Dee was herself a rising star with an aura of innocence that appealed to young audiences. Pairing her with Troy proved a masterstroke, as teenage viewers flocked to see this sun-drenched romance unfold. The film's success shot Troy Donahue into the upper tier of teen heartthrobs. He became the face that magazine editors loved to feature, a blonde, clean-cut image of youthful idealism. For a stretch, it felt as though nothing could impede his ascent. This was not just about box office receipts. It was about becoming a cultural symbol, a representation of a particular vision of American adolescence. Hollywood's star-making process during that era relied heavily on consistent visibility. A star needed to churn out a series of pictures within a short time frame to keep audiences engaged and to affirm their place in the public imagination. Warner Brothers, recognizing Troy's potential, wasted little time in leveraging that success. In 1961, Troy starred in Parrish, a drama that cast him in the role of a young man caught in the tobacco industry's rivalries. Warner Brothers again poured resources into promotion. Promotional tours, interviews, and the cycle of carefully managed publicity all conveyed that Troy Donahue was the next big star, a fair-haired beacon of the romantic escapism audiences seemed to crave. During these golden years, Troy's life was a whirl of premieres, lavish Hollywood parties, and the sometimes overwhelming attention that comes with fame. He was photographed everywhere, on set, at home with a dog or cat, strolling on the studio lot. Publicists ensured that fan magazines ran puff pieces describing Troy's favorite hobbies, his daily routines, or even his dating life. These carefully packaged narratives portrayed him as the epitome of a wholesome American boy. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Troy struggled to reconcile these expectations with his own private insecurities and an inclination toward heavy drinking, an inclination that would spiral in the years to come. Even so, Troy's early stardom was genuinely dazzling. A Summer Place, bolstered by its now iconic theme song by Percy Faith, stayed in people's minds long after the film's release. It quickly became synonymous with the 1950s and early 1960s melodrama. Images from the film, Troy's tanned face and Sandra Dee's shy smile, were frequently reprinted in retrospectives of the era's youth culture. Troy benefited immensely, his name firmly planted among the leading men of that moment. Audiences might not have recognized the complexity beneath the studio-groomed exterior, but they embraced him wholeheartedly. Yet for all the glitz, one could argue that Troy was more famous for being famous than for any specific acting triumph. This phenomenon was especially pronounced in the teen heartthrob world. Young fans followed him loyally, buying magazines, postcards, and any memorabilia that bore his likeness. But serious film critics were less impressed. They questioned whether Troy had the range and depth to navigate beyond lightweight romance roles. Some pointed to contemporary stars like James Dean or Marlon Brando, who, although older, had demonstrated emotional intensity that resonated deeply with critics. In comparison, Troy's performances, no matter how charming, were seen as more ephemeral. Still, the public's adoration cannot be discounted. In an industry that depends on audience approval, Troy Donahue's star burned bright for a time. That period from the late 1950s through the early 1960s could be viewed as his personal Camelot, a shining but short-lived epoch that would soon give way to darker days. Yet in the moment, it was all promise. The big studio contracts, the adoring crowds, the sense that Troy Donahue had arrived and would remain a staple of the silver screen. No one, perhaps not even Troy himself, could have predicted how rapidly it would all unravel. Peak fame and decline. At the apex of Troy Donahue's stardom, his face graced the covers of countless magazines targeting the teen demographic, from Photoplay to 17. His popularity in these publications often eclipsed his actual film projects. Indeed, for many fans, their affection was driven by Troy's image rather than by the roles he played. And that image was meticulously controlled. The teen idol with a bright smile, immaculate style, and a wholesome aura. At a time when films often served as escapist fantasies, Troy, young, affable, and classically handsome, fit perfectly into the role of the daydream-worthy leading man. Parrish, released by Warner Brothers in 1961, stands out as perhaps the pinnacle of Troy's popularity. His portrayal of a conflicted youth in the midst of a tobacco war was well received, though critics pointed out that the film's success owed much to the marketing push and the resonance Troy had already built with fans through A Summer Place. Regardless, Parrish solidified him as an icon for teenage audiences of the early 1960s. This film remains even today one of the first titles many fans associate with Troy Donahue, an emblem of what he once was, a golden-haired symbol of a gentler cinematic era. But Hollywood is famous for being fickle. Tastes shift quickly, and the 1960s brought about a seismic change in popular culture. The British invasion in music and the gradual shift toward more socially conscious cinema began nudging aside the polished boy-next-door archetype. For an actor who had risen swiftly to fame through roles largely dependent on romantic appeal and a carefully curated public persona, the risk of stagnation was significant. Where could Troy go next, and what roles could he adopt that wouldn't be swallowed by these cultural tidal waves? The studios were less adept at transitioning their young stars into more mature roles if the stars hadn't already established considerable range. Some, like Paul Newman or Steve McQueen, emerged as tough, charismatic leads embodying the rebellious spirit of the decade. Troy Donahue, by contrast, remained stuck in the teen idol mold. Adding to the challenge, Troy's contract with Warner Brothers was abruptly terminated in 1966. For an actor in his prime who relied heavily on the studio's infrastructure, being cut loose felt like a betrayal. Once a golden boy under the Warner Brothers banner, Troy found himself without a stable employer. The psychological impact of this blow cannot be overstated. Having built his identity, and to some extent his self-worth, on being a studio-backed star, Troy now had to confront an industry that was less interested in him than it had been just a few years prior. There was no Netflix or streaming platform back then, where one might pivot to new forms of content. There were fewer opportunities, and many of them required auditioning alongside countless other displaced actors. In the mid-1960s, the box office was increasingly dominated by musicals like The Sound of Music or bold new projects that paved the way for the new Hollywood revolution. Meanwhile, teen magazines began featuring a new generation of faces, pop music idols, and emerging film actors who had different, edgier personas that matched the spirit of change. As these cultural and industrial shifts took hold, Troy struggled to find a place. He was no longer the new, exciting star. The public's attention had drifted, and the studios had moved on to younger talents or to established older actors who exuded more gravitas. By the late 1960s, Troy's phone rang less and less with substantial offers. Instead, he picked up smaller parts here and there, many of them forgettable guest spots on television series or roles in low-budget films that never approached the success of his early hits. The sense of drifting, combined with intensifying substance abuse, propelled Troy further down a destructive path that would lead ultimately to an astonishing downfall in the 1980s. Reflecting on this time, Troy would later describe it as a lost period, a limbo where he felt unsure of himself and unsupported in the industry. The dissonance between the public memory of Troy as the poster boy for sun-kissed romance and the personal torment he experienced made it difficult for him to reach out for help. He was aware that his once sterling reputation was diminishing in the eyes of casting directors and producers. Pride, confusion, and addiction can create a toxic cocktail that makes it almost impossible to navigate life's obstacles rationally. Troy found himself sinking deeper into that abyss. On the surface, the narrative might have just seemed like another Hollywood star stumbling off track, but for those who knew him personally, it was tragic to watch a once glittering figure lose so much of his radiance, and so quickly. Role in The Godfather and childhood friendship with Coppola Troy was old friends with Francis Ford Coppola. By the 1970s, Troy Donahue's career was nowhere near what it had been just a decade previously. Still, the actor managed to secure a small role in the sequel to one of the biggest films of all time. Many fans that aren't that familiar with Troy's life story may wonder how exactly that fading star managed to secure a role, however slight, in The Godfather Part 2. The film was released in 1974, and Troy certainly wasn't a big selling point in films at that time. The reason that Troy appeared in The Godfather Part 2 was because he was a friend of Francis Ford Coppola's during his childhood. While attending the aforementioned military academy after the death of his father, and before his enrollment at Columbia University, Francis was one of Troy's classmates. The two befriended in each other, and that friendship lasted into their adulthoods. Another fun trivia fact about Troy's appearance in The Godfather Part 2 is that the character that he played in the film was actually named after himself. The character was named Merle Johnson, which astute viewers will recall was Troy's birth name. Hitting rock bottom and recovery, Troy hit rock bottom. During the early 1980s, sadly, Francis Ford Coppola threw his old friend a bone by giving him a role in what was arguably the biggest movie sequel ever up until that point. Didn't help things much when it came to Troy Donahue's personal problems and dwindling career. Troy was still having trouble securing notable roles that weren't handed to him by old friends, and he was still sinking further and further into the throes of substance abuse. What started out as simple alcoholism quickly grew to include painkillers and stimulants. By the time the 1980s rolled around, Troy Donahue was homeless. The actor was said to have been sleeping in New York City's Central Park, not far from where he had been born and raised. It was around this time that Troy realized that he was going to need to make a change, otherwise he was going to die. With limited career prospects coming his way via the entertainment industry, Troy managed to find employment as an acting instructor on cruise ships around Holland. Though teaching acting classes on cruise ships was certainly a step down from being a teenage heartthrob, Troy Donahue knew that the most important thing was that he was getting his act back together. He joined AA in 1982 and remained sober until his death around the turn of the century. By that point, Troy was on his way towards a minor career revival of sorts, having recently toured with a production of Bye Bye Birdie. During the early 1990s, he also appeared in a few low-budget films that went direct to video. Once again, this was certainly a step down from the actor's Hollywood days, but it was a step up from his days of sleeping in Central Park. Demise and final moments. Tragically, Troy Donahue's long-fought battle for stability came to an abrupt end in the summer of 2001. On August 30th of that year, he experienced a heart attack and was quickly rushed to the hospital for surgery. By this point, Troy was doing relatively well in life. He lived in Santa Monica with a woman who would have become his fifth wife. He was sober, participating in sporadic acting gigs, and living a quieter existence than he once had. The surgery he underwent on August 30th was initially successful, offering a hopeful reprieve. Fate, however, had other plans. The very next day, Troy suffered a second heart attack, necessitating yet another surgery. This time, the outcome was not as fortunate. Complications arose and he did not survive. On September 2nd, 2001, Troy Donahue, the one-time teenage heartthrob, the man who had wrestled with alcoholism and homelessness and then found sobriety, passed away. Before he died, Troy was visited by longtime friend Connie Stevens, with whom he had remained close ever since their collaboration on 1961's Susan Slade. Much like Sandra Dee, Connie Stevens was often cited as an actress who overshadowed Troy during their shared prime. Yet Connie's presence at his deathbed stands as a testament that there was genuine friendship, forged in the crucible of early stardom and sustained through the decades. Her visit also highlights how Troy, for all his tribulations, managed to remain in the good graces of certain colleagues who saw beyond his public persona. Troy's passing at the turn of the new century might have slipped under the radar for the general public, particularly those unfamiliar with early 1960s teen idols. But it held great significance for the network of friends, fans, and family who cherished him. He was survived by 2 children, Janine and Sean, and 3 grandchildren. The circumstances surrounding his discovery of Sean's existence encapsulate the way Troy's addictions affected his personal life. Sean's mother, neither one of Troy's wives nor his final fiancée, chose not to inform Troy of his son's birth until Sean was already 13, presumably waiting for a time when Troy was sober and in a position to offer stable fatherly guidance. Once he learned he had a son, Troy attempted to be there for Sean, forging a relationship that endured until Troy's death. For those who admired Troy in his prime, the details of his final years offered a somber reminder of how swiftly and dramatically life can change. He had gone from one of the most recognizable faces on magazine covers to a man battling homelessness and addiction, then fought his way back to sobriety, only to be claimed by heart failure at age 65. In a sense, Troy's journey came full circle. He spent his early years ensconced in relative affluence in New York, ended up losing everything, and then regained just enough stability to retire quietly in Santa Monica, not far from the showbiz capital that had once embraced him. Even in his last days, Troy Donahue was candid about the role addiction had played in derailing his life. Whether in interviews or in conversations with friends, he acknowledged that being loaded all the time had made him incapable of seizing the career opportunities that might have come his way. It's a rare moment of stark honesty from a man whose early fame was built on a meticulously orchestrated facade of youthful perfection. His death marked the closing of a tumultuous chapter in Hollywood history, one that had begun with glossy magazine shoots and ended in a hospital room surrounded by the few who still cared. Legacy and conclusion. Troy Donahue isn't mentioned much nowadays, and he doesn't get a lot of respect when he is. The actor was notably one of the inspirations for Phil Hartman's character of Troy McClure on The Simpsons, with the other inspiration being Doug McClure. Like many teenage heartthrobs over the years, Troy was derided for what was perceived as a lack of talent and an overemphasis on his movie star good looks. Though many consider Troy Donahue to have been overshadowed by his leading ladies, Connie Stevens thought enough of him to visit him on his deathbed. That's the content of today's video. If you enjoy the video, give us a like, comment, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive more of our new videos. Thanks for watching.